476 AD. A teenage barbarian warlord walks into a palace and tells the last Roman emperor to leave. No battle, no fire, no last stand, just a quiet dismissal, and almost nobody noticed. That emperor was 16 years old. His name was Romulus Augustulus. The man who sent him home was a Germanic general named Odoacer. Odoacer didn't even bother declaring himself emperor. He sent the imperial crown to Constantinople and went about his business. The Western Roman Empire, one of the most powerful institutions in human history, ended with a shrug. But here's the thing that should stop you cold. The people living through it didn't know it was the end. They didn't write it down as a catastrophe. They didn't ring any bells. So what exactly fell on September 4th, 476? And did anything fall at all? To understand that, you have to understand what Rome had already become by that point. The empire had split in two in 395 AD. There was an eastern half centered in Constantinople and a western half, increasingly unstable, increasingly hollow. By 476, the Western Emperor wasn't even running things. Barbarian generals had been the real power for decades. The emperor was a figurehead, a useful face on a coin, and Rome itself wasn't even the capital anymore. Ravenna was a city in northeastern Italy, easier to defend, closer to the action. The Senate still sat in Rome, passing resolutions, holding ceremonies, but it had no real authority. The institution was a costume, not a government. So when Odoacer walked into Ravenna's palace that September, he wasn't toppling a functioning empire. He was filing the paperwork on something that had already died. Now consider this. The writers of that era barely mentioned the coup. Bishop Augustine, one of the most important thinkers of the time, had already written his masterwork decades earlier. He was more concerned with the spiritual fate of civilization than with who held the throne in Ravenna. Life in Italy didn't stop. Taxes were still collected, laws were still enforced. The Catholic Church kept its records, maintained its hierarchy, administered its parishes. For an ordinary farmer in Tuscany or a merchant in Milan, Tuesday the 4th looked a lot like Monday the 3rd. The Eastern Empire in Constantinople considered itself the real Rome, and it kept going for another 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire lasted until 1453. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks that year. If you want a dramatic last stand, a city in flames, a civilization fighting to its final breath, that's your moment. Not 476. So who decided 476 was the fall? An English historian named Edward Gibbon. He published his landmark history in 1776, 3 centuries after the fact. Gibbon needed a date. Historians always needed a date. So 476 became the date, and it stuck. But here's what Gibbon couldn't explain in a single date. What do you do with 200 years of slow unraveling? The real collapse was a process, not a moment, start in the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome cycled through 26 emperors, 26 in 50 years. Most of them died violently. The army was making and unmaking emperors faster than the Senate could keep track. The economy was crumbling. Emperors debased the currency, flooding the market with lower-quality coins to pay their bills. Inflation followed, trade slowed, cities shrank. The tax base eroded, which meant less money for the military, which meant weaker borders, which meant more raids, which meant more instability. Plagues swept through the empire multiple times. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd. Each one hollowed out the population. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, fewer farmers, fewer taxpayers, and the army itself was changing. Rome had always absorbed outside peoples into its legions. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, entire barbarian units were fighting under Roman banners, commanded by barbarian officers loyal to barbarian generals. Odoacer himself was the product of this system. He was Roman in everything but blood. So think of it this way. Asking when Rome fell is like asking when a glacier disappears. You can't point to a single day. You watch it retreat year by year, season by season, and then one morning you look up and it's gone, and you realize you couldn't name the moment it ended. But here's the question nobody asks. What actually died? The Latin language didn't die. It evolved. It became French. It became Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. 500 million people today speak languages that descended directly from the tongue of Roman soldiers and merchants. Latin itself survived in the Catholic Church for another 1,000 years as the language of scholarship and prayer. Roman law didn't die either. The legal codes developed under Rome became the foundation of nearly every European legal system. Contracts, property rights, citizenship, due process. These weren't invented fresh in the Middle Ages. They were inherited, adapted, preserved. The Catholic Church structured itself along Roman administrative lines. Dioceses followed the old Roman provincial boundaries. Bishops filled the role that Roman governors once held. The Church became Rome's institutional heir, carrying its organizational logic forward across centuries. Roads, aqueducts, the Roman arch, the Roman grid city, the Roman idea of urban public life, all of it survived, was copied, was built upon. Rome didn't vanish. It dissolved. It poured itself into everything around it and kept going in a different form. The fall of Rome is less like a building collapsing and more like a river changing course. So what does any of this mean? Empires rarely end with a single decisive moment. They end when people stop believing in them, when the institutions hollow out from within, when soldiers owe their loyalty to men, not to ideas, when the paperwork of government continues, but the spirit behind it is already gone. 476 is a useful date. It gives historians a hook, a chapter break, a place to start the next sentence. But the people living through it didn't experience it as a fall. They experienced it as a Tuesday and then another Tuesday. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world they had known became something different. And Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor. Odoacer sent him to live in a comfortable villa on the coast of Campania. He received a pension. He probably watched the sea. He may have lived another 30 years. He never tried to reclaim his throne. He seems to have had no particular interest in being emperor at all. The last ruler of the Western Roman Empire retired to the beach, and the empire he had nominally led disappeared so quietly that most of his contemporaries didn't bother to write it down. Every civilization believes it will recognize its own ending. Rome never did. The question is whether we would recognize ours.